Okay, so hello again. For the people who didn't see my last presentation, my name is Corey. I'm a writer for different places, Movie Mezzanine, a few others. I wasn't supposed to present today. It was supposed to be, my friend Amir Sultani was going to be here, and actually, I'm sorry to be a bit of a disappointment in that sense. He is I think this is a wonderful movie. He's even a bigger fan of it, and he was very excited to be presenting it. Unfortunately, he became quite sick actually over the last week. He's doing a bit better now, but I know he wanted to do this. Anyway, he asked me to fill in, and when he asked me to present, I wasn't actually sure that I wanted to do it at first, partly because of the short notice, but also because I'd only seen the movie once 4 years ago, and while I liked it, I didn't think that I remembered it too well. Watching it again a couple of days ago in preparation for this, I realized that actually I quite love the movie, and that I remembered almost every single scene in it exactly as it happened. So it's obviously the movie kind of sticks with you in a way. I wasn't really that familiar with the director's work outside of this movie. The director is Agnès Varda. She's actually from Belgium, but she made movies in France. The only other movie I'd seen of hers is an autobiographical documentary that she made a few years ago called Beaches of Agnes. The thing, there's a lot to say about this movie. I like a lot about it. I mean, people here generally touched on it. It's quite a beautiful movie. It's a little bit enigmatic. Like, it's not always clear entirely what it's about from scene to scene. One scene is like about one thing, one is about another. The filmmaking techniques are quite amazing. The movie was made in 1962, kind of right during the French New Wave period. But one thing to note about Agnes Varda is that though she was making movies in that period, and though she's often talked about as being a French New Wave filmmaker alongside Truffaut and Godard and Romer and those guys, she was actually part of a slightly different movement that was happening at the same time, and actually even preceded the French New Wave. Her first movie that came before this one was made in 1955, which is like 4 or 5 years before the 400 Blows, Truffaut's movie that really started the French New Wave. And if you watch that film, it's called La Pointe Courte. I watched it yesterday for the first time. It's pretty remarkable, the filmmaking techniques. Everything that she was doing there shows up later in like Breathless and these other big movies. So she was kind of ahead of things in a lot of ways. The main difference between the movement that she was a part of, which featured other filmmakers like Alain Resnais, Chris Marker, and Jacques Demy, who was her husband, they called them the left bank, le rive gauche. They were not as influenced by filmmaking as the Cahiers de Cinema French New Wave people were. They had seen movies, obviously they were interested in film, but their biggest influences were, French philosophy, existentialism, literature, plastic modeling, like experimental filmmaking, those kinds of things. That's the kind of stuff that they were interested in. And I think that when you watch this movie, it shows quite a lot. There's a lot of, more than just the editing techniques and that kind of stuff. There's some very experimental camera movements and stuff like that that, in fact, you don't even see Godard doing until years later. The movie is quite political. You hear a lot in there about the war in Algeria. You see a lot of the way that she depicts the different classes kind of interacting and maybe not interacting so much. There's a lot of the philosophy, which you talked about. To be honest, a lot of that stuff flies a little bit over my head. I know a little bit about the Algerian War. I know a little bit about French existentialism, but not a lot. To me, what's striking in this movie is the way that Varda chooses to depict the woman at the center. she's a character who, you know, on the surface, quite lacks substance. You know, she's a singer. She doesn't write the music, and it's commented on that she believes that the songwriters don't even think she has talent. You know, she's a blonde. She's very carefree. She's also quite selfish. You know, she displays this over and over again, that she's really kind of concerned with herself. In a lot of movies, particularly movies preceding this, but even many afterward, a character like her would not really be getting sympathy from the film. She would probably not be the center of the movie. She might be a character on the side. You know, she's a character who likes to luxuriate in sort of trivial things. And you wouldn't expect that a big, you know, classic movie like this one would focus on a you know, a girl like that. One of the kind of characteristics of her as a character, though, is that she hasn't really felt the need to extend outside of herself. Until this diagnosis with cancer, you know, it's okay that she is just the beautiful girl who everybody looks at. Even the way that the men talk to her or look at her, you see them catcalling her, you see there's the scene where the car pulls up next to her and there's the guys kind of trying to hit on her. And she sort of laughs it off and plays along. Before that, I think it's before, or sorry, after that, when they get into her apartment, there's the great line where her maid tells her before her lover shows up, "Don't talk about your illness, men hate that." Like, you know, and she somehow still plays along with that, and the scene that follows is this very melodramatic, kind of romantic scene. But what you see, actually, from that point onward, is that she's dealing with very real fears of death. And she starts to look outward, outside of herself, at other people, at the world around her, and to try and understand her place within that. She starts showing a kind of a curiosity, even when she's in the cafe at the beginning with the maid, and there's this conversation going on that's actually about her, but she's more interested in listening to the conversation that's happening next to her. And you know, it's the kind of conversation that doesn't necessarily concern anything to do with her, but she's identifying with it because it's something that somebody else is going through, another pain that somebody else is going through. And so almost from the beginning, we're seeing kind of these beginnings of a growth in her character. In that scene, too, it's interesting to note that the way that that is shot, it almost looks like a split screen because she's sitting in front of a mirror. Like, when I first was watching it the other day, I was like, why did they put it as a split screen? Why did they stitch two things? And then I realized, oh no, she's sitting in front of a mirror, so it kind of splits the frame. And mirrors show up a lot in the movie. She's constantly looking at mirrors or passing by mirrors, so you know, she's kind of reflecting herself, all the way up until there's the scene later on where she has the pocket mirror that breaks. And she sees that as a sign, an omen of death. Of course, early in the movie, we see the tarot card reading where she gets the omen of death, but the tarot reader says to her that it means change, it doesn't mean death. And I think that that's actually quite representative of what's going on in the film, is that this death, this looming death that's over her all the time, is causing her to change and reevaluate herself. One of the things that's interesting in this is that Varda she isn't just presenting kind of a critical portrait of this character, although she is in some ways critical of the character. What she's doing a lot is creating a context for the character so that we understand the world that Cléo lives in. We understand the way that other people treat her and the way that she views herself in relation to that. And we see in a lot of ways the points where she starts to reevaluate that, you know, where she starts noticing, there's the scene where she starts noticing people looking at her, the way that she's been looking at other people. And it starts to make her very uncomfortable to the point where she is almost like a circus sideshow. And of course, during that same sequence, we see the street performers, you know, putting stuff through their arms and like eating frogs and kind of weird things like that. with everybody gawking at them. And we see that connection, people gawking at her, people gawking at the street performers, except that all she is just a beautiful woman walking down the street, right? There's also a degree to which that might just be in her mind. Probably people aren't noticing her that much, just a person walking down the street. But how she feels about walking down the street is very important. Kind of going to a lot of the politics of it, the same way that it sort of flies over my head. It actually flies over her head too. There's constantly people talking about these big political, philosophical ideas, and she hears it, and sometimes she listens to it, but she doesn't know how to react to it. She's got kind of bigger concerns. And one of the things that happens near the end that we see is she meets this soldier who's back home on leave from Algeria. And in that moment, the politics actually becomes very real. So it's not these abstract ideas, it's something very real that this person is going through. He talks about how he doesn't understand even why he's fighting this war, like it's sort of a meaningless war. And that has a deep, profound effect on his character. And she begins to see that. She sees that the same way that she's going through this cancer diagnosis and trying to put again the pieces of her life back together, or trying to understand her life, other people are going through the same things, and these big political, philosophical ideas kind of come back into that in a very personal way. And that's something that we see a lot actually in Varda's other films. I watched her first movie, and I watched a couple other ones of hers. And one of the things she does, she always has her kind of main character or characters, but then always branches out to other characters. Even in this one, you see there's a couple moments where the maid, and then there's the friend of hers, the model, who actually have voiceover, commenting on what's going on. It's very unusual considering that they're not the main character. But this is the kind of thing that Varda is very interested in, and it's the kind of thing that, given again the series, women filmmakers, I think she brings a lot of that to it, because she's taking her experience as a woman, going through life, often being expected to be interested in trivial ideas. And Agnes Varda is a very educated woman, she's a filmmaker, she's all of these things, but still she's a woman expected to kind of fulfill certain roles. And she kind of creates this character who not only is expected to fulfill those roles, but in many ways does fulfill those roles. And still that's not enough. And the process of the film is her reconsidering that. And I think that it's very beautiful at the end, after this kind of long series of conversations with this French soldier, and then finally after learning that the sickness is not as bad as she thought it was, that suddenly, having made connections with other people, with other human beings, and understanding that she's not actually so different from any of them, that's finally when she says, "I'm happy." This is the kind of end point of the movie, is her discovering that about herself through the world around her. That's kind of all I have to say, really.
Okay, cool. All right, great. We could do question and answers. We could go to discussion. So